While you can make billboards like these with just a hobby knife, I found that assembly fixtures make the job much easier, especially if you are making more than a single sign. This tutorial will show you how I made mine. These instructions assume that you are already proficient in the use of bench-sized power tools, including saws and routers mounted in router tables. Always wear eye protection when working with these tools, as well as operated in a well-ventilated and lighted area with adequate dust collection. You are responsible for your own safety. As with any project or power tool, if you do not understand how to use the tool safely in the context of the project, do not attempt the operation. I specifically disavow any responsibility for your safety while making these fixtures. Before we begin, I should inform you that another of my hobbies is woodworking, and I have a fairly extensive home shop. To make these fixtures, you will need some type of table saw, chop saw, or radial arm saw for the initial cutting. A band saw will do if you also have a stationary belt sander and miter gauge to make the initial cut of the UHMW smooth and accurate. A substantial router table with a fence and a router lift is absolutely essential. Do not attempt these cuts on a flimsy, small steel router table wannabe. If you do not have a cabinet-grade router table and lift, ask for help from a friend who does, or from a local woodworking club. Perhaps a member of your local train club has one. Do not attempt to make these fixtures without a substantial router, router table, fence, and router lift. If you are still interested, go out and buy a piece of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene from woodworking sources like Woodcraft, Rockler, Amazon, or Peachtree. Peachtree's URL is http://www.ptreeusa.com. UHMW is sold in various thicknesses, and we need a 3/4 inch piece 4 inches wide, which will run about $32 for a 4-foot length, although traveling wood shows often sell such material for about $22. You will also need a 3/32 inch straight-face carbide router bit. I prefer the Whiteside bits, and their part number is SC01A, available from Amazon, Woodcraft, and other vendors. A digital height gauge, like the one from Wixie and other vendors, is very useful. A set of calipers is needed. Finally, 3 or 4 packages of 3x5 index cards. Cross-cut a piece of UHMW 4 1/4 inches long. Stretch pieces of masking tape from each corner to its opposite and draw lines from corner to corner. Where they intersect, draw a line at a 60-degree angle using a drafting triangle. Set your bench saw so that it will take this short piece and cut it straight through the slanted line. Use some sort of hold-down device to make the cut. Use that blade guard, keep your hands away from the blade, and clamp the workpiece securely to avoid kickback. Although you need only one of these pieces, make the second piece for a friend. Place the UHMW piece standing upright, with the sloped edge running from northeast to southwest. You are now facing the side on which we will be cutting on the router table. Now place a piece of masking tape on the opposite side and mark top on the tape. When you do the routing, always make sure the top side is facing up. Take one of the blocks to your router table and insert a 3/32 inch straight-faced carbide bit into the collet. Space the bit 1/2 inch from the fence. I use brass setup blocks from Whiteside to set the fence distance. Adjust the height of the bit to 3/64 inch above the table, about half the thickness of the evergreen 1/64 styrene we used to build the legs of the sign support structure. Run the UHMW along the 2 long edges of the block. These will be used for the vertical and sloped legs. Always use some sort of a push block when routing on a router table. After making these first two cuts, raise the router bit to 0.07 inches and repeat the cuts. Don't try to make these cuts in one pass, as the UHMW will bog down the router and possibly break the bit. The resultant slots will be almost, but not quite, as deep as a piece of evergreen 164 stock is thick. The two slots we just cut will cross each other near the top, and we need to cut off the area above where the legs will meet, but exactly where? There is no set answer to this, but there is a method to find out. Take some evergreen 164 styrene and, using your chopper, cut two pieces approximately 2.5 inches long. Accuracy is not needed here. Take one piece and miter one end, as if you were making a slanted leg. Color the top side of the mitered piece with a dark marker, and also any one edge of the straight piece. Glue the pieces together and place them in the slots you just cut, giving them 30 seconds to bond. The place where the legs meet marks where we need to nip off the top of the fixture. This is most easily done on a table or band saw using a sled. Don't try this with a radial arm or chop saw. Place the workpiece such that the top is as close to the blade as possible without touching the darkened legs, and clamp it down. Don't attempt this operation by holding the workpiece with your hands. Now make a pass. If necessary, move the piece closer to the blade and make another pass, but do not cut into the legs. Repeat the cuts until they are as close to the legs as possible without touching them. As mentioned before, using a band saw with a sled or miter gauge with an extension will also work. For the last fine adjustment, you may want to use a disc sander with a miter gauge and extension. This can be a very dusty way to complete the operation, so make sure to have adequate dust collection and respiratory protection. Now, we want to cut some slots perpendicular to the vertical leg slot to be used for holding the crossmember. We will be making 4 passes for each crossmember slot, one each at approximately 0.04 inches, 0.08 inches, 0.12 and 0.15 inches deep. Do not take deeper cuts, or you risk hogging down the router. Note that these cuts will result in a slot not quite twice as deep as the cuts for the legs. But how far from the fence should the bit be offset? Again, I wish I could give you an exact answer, but the offset will depend on how accurately you made the 4¼ inch cut, how closely you nipped off the top, and exactly how wide the plank was to begin with. They are not always exactly 4 inches wide. So get out your calipers and measure the fixture's height. It should be somewhere between 3 and 3.8 inches. Whatever your measurement is, subtract 2.69, and that is the value of the initial offset. In my case, 3.12 minus 2.69 means the initial offset is 0.43 inches. You probably don't have a gauge block for 0.43 inches, but you do have 3x5 cards, and you can be quite accurate with just these, your calipers, and a rubber band. Grab a handful of index cards and measure their width with your calipers. Insert or withdraw a sufficient number of index cards until the stack meets the distance you want between the bit and the fence. If you are within 0.01 inches, that is good enough, but if necessary, err on the thinner side. Place a rubber band around the deck, and presto, you now have a gauge block to fit your needs. Take your index card gauge block and move the fence that distance away from the perimeter of the bit. Return the bit height to 3/64 of an inch. Route a slot for the crossmember and repeat the cut multiple times at ever increasing depths until it is 0.15 of an inch deep. Take your time and avoid hogging down the router. I made a custom push block to make this operation fast and safe, and you should too. Each subsequent slot is offset 0.276 inches, so make another gauge block 0.27 inches thick. Move the fence back and route another slot in 4 passes. Repeat until you have 5 slots for the cross members. The fixture for the boardwalk is much easier. Just take a piece of UHMW about 6 to 8 inches long, and using your 1/8 inch straight bit, route some slots about 1/100th of an inch deep, very shallow. Move the fence back about 0.145 inches to 0.160 inches using the index card trick, and cut 2 more slots. That's all there is to it. Finally, I made a fixture for attaching the support legs to the face frame assembly. I took a block of 3/4 inch UHMW, 4 inches by 5.5, and cut it parallel to the larger side, about 1 3/8 inches from the fence. One piece is now 1 3/8 or 1.375 by 5.5 inches, and the other 2.5 inches by 5.5. I set aside the larger piece. With the 3/32 inch router bit in the router table, I cut a slot across the long side of the shorter piece, 3/4 of an inch from the fence, approximately 3/64 inches deep, or 0.047 inches. Then, to deepen the cut, I reset the depth of cut to 3/32 of an inch deep and repeated it. I moved the fence back 1 inch and repeated the cuts, resulting in 2 parallel cuts. I again moved the fence back 1 inch and repeated the cuts until I had 5 cuts, evenly spaced across the 1.375 inch face of the UHMW. I then moved the fence back to the original position, 3/4 of an inch from the bit. But before cutting, I moved the fence an additional 0.08 inches further from the router bit, which just happens to be the size of Evergreen 1/64. I lowered the router bit back to 3/64, set the UHMW on the 3/4 inch side, and ran it through. Always use a backer board. I repeated this step with the router bit raised to 3/32. I again moved the fence back by 1 inch and repeated these cuts until I had 5 cuts in the 3/4 inch face. If done correctly, there will be 5 cuts in each of the 2 sides, each 1 inch apart, with the cuts on the short edge offset just a bit from the longer cuts. I then took the bigger block of UHMW and removed the 3/32 bit and replaced it with a larger straight-faced bit, a 1/2 or 3/4 inch bit, or anything in between will do. Our goal here is to make a shallow slot on the face of the workpiece parallel to the shorter side with 1/4 inch wings on either side. I set the fence to 1/4 inch away from the bit and the depth to 1/32 of an inch or thereabouts. The depth is not critical at this point, but just not so deep as to bog down the router. I ran the block across its 2.5 inch face and then rotated it to the other side and repeated the cut. I moved the fence further from the bit and repeated the 2 cuts, thus widening the slot. I kept moving the fence and routing the 2 ends until they met in the middle. I moved the fence back to its original 1/4 inch offset and raised the bit to 3/32 and repeated the series of cuts to make the big slot a bit deeper. I kept repeating, increasing the depth until I got to about 0.15 inches deep. Now for the final cut, and it needs to be accurate. Using my Wixie depth gauge, I set the depth of cut to 0.16 inches, or as close to that depth as I could get, and repeated the cuts a final time. 0.16 inches just happens to be the thickness of the Evergreen 1/64 sign leg, the Evergreen 9040 face, and the 8210 face frame, and the 8206 back stiffeners. With these two pieces cut, we need to glue them together. Earlier, I said I like UHMW because very little sticks to it. Well, you can stick two pieces together with contact cement, but the bond is not very strong. But it is strong enough for our purposes if we give it 48 hours to cure and treat it with respect. Follow the label instructions for your contact cement. Place the two pieces on a flat surface, such as a piece of glass. Make sure the slotted side of the larger piece is facing up. The long slotted side of the short piece is facing up, and the slotted edge of the short piece is facing the larger piece. Rough sand the matching pieces. Place the two long sides next to each other. Now move the two pieces together and mark on the depressed slot where the plunging slots will fall. Glue both sides, trying to avoid getting glue in the slots or where the slots will line up on the other side. Wait the time stated in the instructions, clamp, and wait another 48 hours. Once cured, I cut off the wings, the elevated parts of the large slotted area, with a bandsaw. This completes this series of tutorials on creating billboards for model railroads. I hope you found it informative. Good luck and stay safe.